Across history, societies have been shaped by two very different forms of power. One claims authority from tradition, faith, and a higher moral order. The other claims authority from force, ideology, and control. Both can command obedience, but only one accepts limits. Kingship is one of the oldest forms of governance in human history, a system that was accepted and sustained by its people for thousands of years. But at its core, it was never meant to be absolute power. In many civilizations, a king ruled under something greater than himself. In medieval Europe, that authority was God and divine law. In Asia, it was the Buddha's teachings, Dhamma, the moral order of the universe. A king could govern, judge, and protect, but he was also expected to uphold a sacred duty. To violate that duty was not just political failure, it was moral failure. Tradition, religion, and continuity formed limits around the throne. A king inherited not just power, but responsibility to preserve a people, a culture, and a moral order across generations. This is why many monarchies endured for centuries. Their legitimacy was not based on force alone, but on continuity, belief, and restraint. A dictatorship emerges in a very different way. It does not inherit power, it takes it, often through revolution, crisis, or collapse. And once power is seized, it no longer answers to tradition or faith. The state becomes the highest authority. In many authoritarian systems, religion is suppressed, replaced, or controlled, not because faith is irrelevant, but because it competes with power. History offers clear examples. The Soviet Union suppressed religion and elevated the state. Maoist China replaced spiritual tradition with ideology. The Khmer Rouge erased history, culture, and belief entirely. In these systems, there is no higher law above the ruler. The government defines truth, morality, and justice. And without limits, power expands, often at the cost of human life, freedom, and dignity. The difference between kingship and dictatorship is not just political, it is foundational. Kingship places law above the ruler. Dictatorship places the ruler above the law. Kingship draws from tradition and faith. Dictatorship draws from ideology and control. Kingship preserves continuity. Dictatorship often destroys the past to rebuild society from zero. One is constrained by something higher. The other recognizes no higher authority at all. Here is where history becomes more nuanced. The United States did not begin as a rejection of kingship itself. It began as a defense of rights. For years, the American colonists saw themselves as loyal subjects of the British crown. Their grievance was not with the idea of a king, but with the violation of a principle, taxation without representation. They believed that, under English law, no free people could be taxed without their consent. In fact, the colonists appealed directly to King George III, asking him to intervene and restore justice. Only when those appeals were rejected, and the crown declared them in rebellion, did the break become final. The Declaration of Independence was not a rejection of all monarchy, but a legal and moral argument against a ruler who, in their view, had broken the political bond. From the American perspective, independence began in 1776, but in practical and international terms, British sovereignty did not truly end until 1783, when the Crown formally recognized the United States as free and independent states. This is why the United States, despite being a republic, has often aligned with monarchies in global affairs. Because both systems, at their best, recognize that power must be limited by law, tradition, or moral order. During the Cold War and beyond, Monarchies in regions like Thailand, Jordan, and the Gulf states were seen as stable, tradition-based systems, resistant to revolutionary movements that often led to authoritarian rule. The divide was never simply king versus republic. It was ordered systems versus unconstrained power. History reveals a recurring pattern. When long-standing monarchies collapse suddenly, they are often not replaced by freedom, but by centralized ideology and control. In Russia, the fall of the Tsar led to Soviet totalitarianism. In Cambodia, instability gave rise to the Khmer Rouge. In Iran, the monarchy was replaced by a different form of authoritarian rule. The promise is often liberation. The outcome is often consolidation of power. Because when tradition, faith, and inherited limits are removed, a vacuum is created. And in that vacuum, power does not disappear, it concentrates. Ultimately, the stability of a civilization does not come from the strength of its walls, but from the spirit of its people within its walls. For a home, a community, and a nation to truly be at peace, there must be a foundation of love and compassion. There must be a rule of law that keeps its citizens grounded, not because they are coerced by force, but because they are guided by will. When people believe in the moral rightness of their laws, they walk the tightrope of society with purpose. In the end, the question is not about kings or republics. It is about limits. Should power answer to something higher, law, tradition, or a sacred moral order? Or should power answer only to itself? We must remain vigilant, for history has shown us that when faith is removed, when tradition is mocked, and when nothing stands above power, power becomes absolute. And where power is absolute, the human spirit is never truly free.